through this session, we're going to show you why it's important to work with crime victims, how you can work with crime victims, and that the bottom doesn't need to fall out from under all the good work that you've done. So with that, let me put you through, so who we are, who the National Center is. We help state and local grassroots organizations better provide for victim needs. We advocate for victims' rights. We are a training and technical assistance provider. And what we know, 6 in 10 crime victims want criminal justice system that provides prevention and rehabilitation over punishment. That holds true even amongst violent crime victims, among violence crimes. Most crime victims value alternatives to incarceration programs such as mental health and drug treatment, community supervision, and community service programs. Many crime victims do not support policies that would expand private prisons, and most crime victims believe additional law enforcement funding should go to providing training for police on how to de-escalate situations with mental health individuals, providing diversion programs for people with drug addiction issues. What we believe, victims' rights need to be considered in justice reform. Reformers and victims should see one another as allies, not as adversaries. Victims need a voice if the justice reform is going to be equitable. Traditional victim versus offender dichotomies are inaccurate. In-jail populations may also be victims and experience resulting trauma. Okay, this is a slide that always wowed me. So these are the issues that a lot of individuals have in prison. So you can see that the thing that exists almost throughout your jail population is that these people have a lifetime history of trauma. What that means is that for men, 91% of your population has been a victim of crime. So with that, let's go on to our panelists today. So we have Abbey Stamp from Multnomah County, Ronald Simpson-Bey from the Justice Leadership USA, and Anna Harper from Emergent Center Against Domestic Violence. So thank you for being here today. So can we start with Ronald? Ronald, why don't you tell us a little bit about what you're doing and a little bit about yourself?
Thank you. Is it on? Good morning. Thank you for having me, and it's an honor and a pleasure to be here with you this morning. My name is Ronald Simpson-Bey. I'm the Director of Outreach and Alumni Engagement for Just Leadership USA, which is a national advocacy organization committed to cutting the national prison population in half by 2030. And we believe that those closer to the problem are closer to the solutions. So that's why we uplift the voices of the directly impacted people in this space of reform these days. What brings me to the table, I'm both victim and offender. I have been a victim of crime, and I have been in prison for crime. And I'll go a little bit more into that during the presentation. But thank you.
Thank you, Ronald. Abbey?
Good morning. Abbey Stamp. I'm the Executive Director of the Local Public Safety Coordinating Council in Multnomah County, Oregon. That is the Criminal Justice Coordinating Council, and I'm also the Project Director for Multnomah's Safety and Justice Challenge. I met Mai in a taxi because Sharice made us talk. And I started to explain to Mai how we wanted to use our Safety and Justice Challenge funds, which is to open an Afrocentric transitional housing program for justice-involved women, which Lori Garducki alluded to or referred to yesterday. And Mai said, oh, have you thought about whether those individuals are going to be victims of crime or would need any services or tailored programming for being victims as well? And I thought, no. And you're absolutely right. So that conversation with Mai, in addition to some work we did back in 2014, we implemented the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Comprehensive Gang Assessment. And one of the things we learned when we engage over 1,000 members of our community is that sometimes folks who are crime victims don't identify as crime victims, nor do they want to engage in the traditional continuum of services for those who have been victimized.
Anna?
Good morning. My name is Anna Harper-Guerrero. I'm the Executive Vice President at Emerge Center Against Domestic Abuse, which is located in Tucson, Arizona, a part of Pima County. We're the only provider of services in that community. We provide services to survivors, but we also have a small program where we're working with men who have caused harm. And I am a member of our community collaborative for the Safety Justice Grant in Pima County, as well as the steering committee for the collaborative.
Thanks, Anna. So Abby, let's start with you. Why do you think it's important to include crime victim perspectives in criminal justice reform?
I think if we don't include the perspectives of those who have been victims of crime, it is incredibly narrow-minded and is not expansive to what harm repair and healing can possibly look like for those who have been injured. I think from a justice system perspective, it's really easy to fall into that dichotomy that individuals are either offenders or victims, and clearly that is absolutely not the case, that within the same body, perhaps even in the same day, someone can be labeled or put into either the victim or the offender box. And so thinking more expansively about the human experience, in addition to bringing a different perspective to the table outside of the district attorney, the judiciary, and the typical justice system players is an important perspective for us to include.
Thanks, Abby. Ron, picking up on that, what do you think about, what Abby just said, that half the day somebody could be an offender and the other half somebody could be a victim? Does that ring true for you? What is that weird dichotomy that we create in the justice system, and how does that play out in our communities and our jails?
It's definitely it's an issue and a problem. The dichotomy is actually it's a false narrative, because oftentimes people that create harms have been harmed themselves. Because we know that hurt people, and we never consider that in the adjudication of crimes and what have you. We don't consider that the offender has been a victim, may have been a victim, and 90% of the time they usually are, and that the victims themselves often do not want retribution and revenge. They usually want some type of mediation in connection to dealing with the situation. So I think that if we are to overcome this dichotomy, then we have to have a more inclusive dialogue between the parties.
What did that mean in your personal story?
In my personal story, as I mentioned before, I was incarcerated in Michigan for 27 years on a wrongful conviction. And while I was in prison on Father's Day in 2001, I was waiting for my children to come visit, and my only son was murdered by a 14-year-old juvenile on Father's Day. And so I advocated for the child to be treated as a juvenile, not as an adult. But the problem was, when I was advocating that, the prosecutor's office didn't see me as a traditional victim, because I was poor, I was in prison at the time, and they would not recognize my voice. So I really had to push and advocate really hard for them to waive him as a juvenile and not as an adult. So for me, it was personal. And the people I've seen while I was in prison before I was released, a lot of them had similar situations where they were victims of crime, family members had been victims, they tried to express their voices and they weren't heard.
And that was amazing that you were trying to advocate on behalf of the young man who killed your son.
Yes.
But did you, while you were there, did people know that this had happened, and did they provide you with any extra services or extra anything?
Oh, they knew that it happened, because I was trying to get services to go to the funeral, and so the administration knew. Everybody from the warden down knew about it, but I wasn't providing any type of services, any type of trauma care after it happened, any type of counseling. Nothing was. It was just like I was on my own.
Okay, thanks. Anna, you come at this as basically the only victim representative at the table in your county. How has that been for you? What's been the good experiences, the middle experiences, not so good experiences?
Yeah. I think it's an interesting conversation to have. I think one of the things I want to say is that in the field of domestic abuse over the last decade, we've had very similar realizations about the harm that we've caused in the way that we've designed systems and services, i.e., many survivors told us when we criminalize domestic violence, please don't do that. We don't want our partners arrested and put in jail. But we sort of thought we knew best. We were doing the risk assessment, and so we decided that that's how it should be handled. So here we are years later, really trying to think about how to undo that harm. And that looks like listening to survivors and how we deliver services to them. Many of them want their family. So for me, coming into the collaborative, at first I was nervous that there was no way they were gonna let me on this collaborative. Because I thought, they're gonna think that I'm here to just push back and resist and point out all the things that they're doing wrong. But really, for me, it was about investing in our community and seeing that the way that we intervene in families and with individuals who are suffering really matters for the long-term trajectory of our community, in addition to that individual person. And so I feel like a lot of criminal justice reform efforts really parallels what we're realizing about how we deliver services to individual survivors in our community in terms of undoing harm. And with that, I think at this point I've sort of been playing a role of observing and listening and watching. And I know that as we proceed with our grant in our community, I'm hopeful that there are going to be different kinds of opportunities to really engage in a more direct way around how we engage survivors.
Have there been clashes?
No, I wouldn't say overt clashes. I wouldn't call it that. I think that in the community of folks who are not a part of the collaborative or project, there are questions, there are anxieties about how is this going to be handled, what are the criteria that we're using to determine whether someone should be released, those kinds of questions that are really about, just a history of mistrust with the system that we all know is there. It's there for people who have been incarcerated and who we're now trying to engage in reform efforts, and it's also there on the part of victims or survivors who have had experiences with the system. So to me, it makes a lot of sense to listen to both sides of that in terms of impact.
And Ronald, what's been your experience when you've gone out and talked to communities about reform efforts?
The community, actually, that's a great question, because in my previous job, I developed a project called the Good Neighbor Project, which was a long-term collaborative co-mentorship between people in prison in Michigan and the community. And I would go out and do community discussions around, the harms caused by people incarcerated. And what I found that I had built this project on restorative justice principles, and the community was really open to that. They were open to having or hearing how we could heal the harms on both sides, because in traditional restorative justice, it's been a practice of, one-on-one dialogue between the victim and the offender. But through the project, we expanded the restorative justice principles to the community, and so they could have a conversation around what that would look like, and what it looked like for the people that come home from prison. They would have I pitched it in a way that would give them a voice to determine what type of person returns to their community. So the community has really been open to that, and it's a different dynamic when you have them in a community setting, having engagement, instead of when they're in court or in some law enforcement proceeding. Because I've seen situations where we've had victims' families from both sides, the offender and the victim, be in the same audience, and they embrace and talk, and then they talk about ways to, move forward instead of just being, punitive and harsh. So it's been a very interesting
Have you
conversation.
gotten pushback in the past? People who don't want to see collaborations, they really want to keep that dichotomy going?
Oh, of course. I mean, we get considerable pushback from the law enforcement community, some from the community, because people haven't healed from their own harms, and sometimes they can't see beyond the pain which they're suffering, so they want to see somebody else suffer. Like I said, hurt people. Until they get past the hurt that they're feeling, oftentimes they don't want to see that type of reform.
Abbey, what kind of services do you provide the women in your project in order to help them get through their victimization?
So there's a few things that are happening and a few things that are still under development. It's still very new. And so the referral source for the justice-involved women who are eligible to spend some time in the transitional housing program are primarily on probation. So the Department of Community Justice, which is the Parole and Probation Authority, has a gender-specific unit which works with women and families, and it is very close to the facility where the transitional housing program is. And they have a lot of support specifically for women, having validated risk assessments, working primarily on the criminogenic needs for women, but also really understanding the potential victimization and how that leads to future justice involvement from the offender side. The program itself is staffed by all peers, all women who have lived life justice experience and primarily who are in recovery and have articulated been victimized themselves. And so we have been working diligently both with the county and the unfortunate but necessary bureaucratic processes it takes to create a contract and procure the services, but focusing on trauma-informed and culturally specific services for women, not only focusing on the traditional criminogenic needs. So something like TREM, the trauma recovery empowerment model, and also perhaps trauma-informed yoga, which we have in our community, and other services which are in the process of being procured with the voice of those with lived experience to ensure that is the right approach to assisting the clients in the house.
Do people come to your program or identifying as victims?
That's a very good question. I don't think I should answer that because I haven't worked directly with the women in the house. I haven't been able to sit down and ask them those questions. For deeper information about how this process is working, we are ramping up the clientele, finally moving into our permanent site after being in a temporary location due to construction delays and permitting issues. My project manager, Sarah Mullen, is here, who has been incredibly involved in all of the details of launching the program itself. I will say that in the discussions and the events we have held with the women who are the staff, who perhaps 10, 15 years ago could have been a client, there is a discussion about being exposed to violence and particularly some street violence and intimate partner violence as well. But I wouldn't want to say whether they identify as victims because I haven't asked directly.
Ronald, how about you if we take that question? Do you feel like the individuals that you spent time with in prison identified as victims?
Mostly not, and most people in prison do not identify as victims, or they have, at least men anyway, they have a tough time identifying as victims, because, and especially in the black community, black men, we don't see ourselves as victims. You know, we just feel like if something happened to us, it's something we just deal with and move on, and it's hard to even get them to talk about being a victim. They don't even think about it. And I've been part of an expert work group with the Vera Institute, and we've been having this discussion around people identifying as victims, and how do we, break that barrier to get people to come forward to get services.
Thank you. Let me ask you, you're at the grassroots level. Your organization is a grassroots organization. What do you think the benefit is or the challenges of having a grassroots organization involved in this work when most of the other partners are system-based?
Sure. Let me just clarify. That question probably comes from a conversation we had in preparation for this. I wouldn't describe Emerge as a nonprofit organization. We're a fairly large mainstream nonprofit. And what we're realizing is that in our growth as a nonprofit and being a system that's a part of larger systems in the community that has an impact on folks, that we've really deviated from some of the practices and things that grassroots folks know about how to be with people. And so in that, we've really been thinking hard about how we're even thinking about the issue of domestic abuse, how we're thinking about survivors and the people that they love who harm them. And again, so you'll notice my language is not to call people abusers or batters or offenders. That's not who they are often to survivors. And so that said, I think that nationally we are seeing movements and grassroots parts of our community to say we want to think about justice differently. We want to think about outcomes differently. And so there's many programs popping up that are about restorative justice models as an alternative to using the criminal justice system. So rather than calling law enforcement when an incident happens, we see communities who are developing processes to address that behavior on their own and to address the safety of survivors in that. And I think that there's a lot of opportunity for us on the system side of things to really learn from that process. And I see them as parallel. That's really what we're talking about doing when we talk about criminal justice reform, is to say, rather than locking people up, not providing them with support, acknowledgement, and the guidance they need to come out and heal from that experience, that doesn't work. We've learned that. So here we are now trying to figure out, well, after all these years that we've learned that doesn't work, we're actually causing more harm, what is the alternative? What is the alternative to that? And so if we're starting with, well, let's release folks, let's not hold them, let's not criminalize them for their suffering, then what do we also do to address some of the behaviors that are happening that are causing harm for people that they love? And how do we integrate those two approaches in a way that centers the experience of survivors, and particularly when we're talking about domestic abuse or sexual violence?
Thank you. Abbey, did you include the victim community in the creation of your program?
Yes, sort of. We, well, so an interesting component about the development of, it's called the Diane Wade House. Diane Wade was an African-American female probation officer in Multnomah County, and she passed on, and so it is dedicated in her memory. We included at the beginning just justice partners, mental health folks, substance use disorder folks, me, other justice professionals, in trying to identify what was the gap and how could we use our MacArthur resource to really fill the right one. And a few themes came out of those very hard meetings. One was an acknowledgement that the criminal justice system has caused harm to communities of color, not just through current over-incarceration, but the legacy of the war on drugs, going back even further to Jim Crow, slavery, that the institutional racism that is perpetuated through traditional justice practice was a piece that we needed to talk about. And that is why we developed a very intentionally Afrocentric approach, identifying that it wasn't just an offender or someone who caused harm to an individual. We wanted to take a systemic perspective as well. So the voice that was at the table to help us work through some of those really hard conversations was an African-American woman who works for Multnomah County in the mental health and substance use disorder division, and she has lived justice experience, and she helped us figure out how to not bureaucratize some of the program development processes we are all very comfortable and used to. So with her input, we slowed down. We actually stopped. We had a listening session with a dozen African-American justice-involved women to really look at how we could better incorporate their voices. And in that, and in our taxi ride conversation, really unpacked and discovered there is a lot of missing perspective and voice, not just about being an African-American individual who's female in Multnomah County, very white Oregon, but what does that look like for the individual's experience, and then how do we develop those perspectives and respond to those needs through the programming that is still under development for the Diane Wade House.
So that happened organically. Would you have woven into your sort of plan on how you were going to do this a more deliberate incorporation of crime victims groups into?
Absolutely, 100%.
And how would that made your program better or your planning more smooth?
You don't know what you don't know. And I think there's a lot we don't know, or we think we know. And Multnomah County is the biggest county in Oregon in terms of population, is where Portland is. And the victim community is not homogenous. And we wanted to start where we could start, but I still think there are many perspectives that we're missing because we don't know what we don't know.
Ronald, what kind of trauma services, or you don't even, if you think that people would shun away from the word trauma in jails or prison, what kind of services would have helped you or helped the individuals that you were sharing time with?
I mean, services that explain what trauma actually is. I mean, there's a lot of misconceptions about what trauma is. You know, we have these, like in prison and even in the community, you have support groups. And what they do, they sit around, they share their trauma. So everybody is triggered and re-triggered by sharing their trauma and hearing their trauma. Instead of having the understanding that trauma is situational, is in the moment. So we have, and at Just Leadership, we have part of our training program is around trauma for our leaders, because all of our leaders are directly impacted, and we realize that trauma, impacts the way that they do their leadership. So we try to teach them that trauma can be empowering by realizing that trauma doesn't survive in a loving community. So if you have a loving situation where people can understand what trauma is about, they don't feel shame, because trauma survives because of shame. When you feel a lot of shame, you don't talk about it. It's the inability to talk about the trauma, and that's from the shame. So when people are triggered, or when they're having these conversations, they should be embraced by the people around them. They should embrace themselves to remove themselves from the traumatic moment and to deal with it, because PTSD is after. It's not that trauma itself, but it's the reliving of the trauma. So we have some type of services to help just explain those simple processes. People can mentally shift from being, traumatized and don't want to talk about it, to being empowered and moving forward with their lives.
Okay. Anna, what would you tell folks about how best to include victim services in their talks about reform, in their actions around reform? How does that happen? What does that look like?
I think that it really is about, if what we're invested in is the definition of reform and repairing harm, then I think it is about creating space for those conversations to happen and listening to, we know how the system works from our perspective, and sometimes I think listening to the impact of how it works can be eye-opening. And I think a lot about the idea of risk, and that's something that in our county we've been engaged in conversations about how to better define risk, particularly with folks who are committing acts of domestic violence. And what we know is that you can have someone who looks like a low-level offender, i.e. they don't have a criminal history, i.e. the arresting incident wasn't particularly physically violent, and have a history that tells us they're really dangerous to their partner. And those two things can be, to reconcile those two things can be a challenge because of the way that the system operates. So far better to sit down with survivors and listen to, well, if the system has limitations with respect to what we can address and what we can legally do with people to address your safety, what are other ways that we can support and help you think about your safety given the limitations? And I think that when I think about alternatives to incarceration and the idea that maybe rather than, putting people in jail, we give them services to address the root cause of what's going on, with the hope that that will mean they don't end up back in the system, right? That's revolutionary. And I think in the case of domestic abuse, it has to be early on. In our county, a case can take a year to play out in the system, and that entire year, that person is out, and they may or may still be causing harm to that survivor. And we have a challenge with being able to get them into services to address their use of violence and abuse early, because right now, it's like, well, they have to be convicted first because you can't stick them in a program because that infers guilt and innocence. There's all these conversations that start happening that only serve the purpose to displace the voice of survivors. At the end of the day, their reality is their reality. It doesn't matter how much we explain to them why this person gets to keep doing what they're doing. So I just think about allowing space for victim advocates or survivors who are invested in change, because there's a difference between believing that people ought to be in jail for what they do and being invested in productive solutions to address root causes of issues. I think those are two different things. But sitting at the table and having those conversations might be frustrating because we feel like there are limits to what we can do. And I also think it can be eye-opening to learn and help us devise better strategies that are alternatives to putting people in jail that also address the needs of survivors so that people don't end up dead, which is what happens often. We've had many cases of low-level offenders who were released and who ended up murdering their partner. And that's a reality for survivors, and so that fear is very real.
Thank you. Abby, how would you tell folks out there to include the victim community, victims' voices, survivors' voices in their work?
I think you got to start somewhere. And for us in Multnomah County, well, for me, from a multidisciplinary team's perspective, looking at the justice system as a multidisciplinary team, recent legislation was passed that required that our Criminal Justice Coordinating Council had community providers who provided services to crime victims or victims of crime at the table. And I thought, how am I supposed to do that? There's dozens or maybe hundreds, I don't know, of providers in our community. And I reached out to who I knew. And I reached out to the director of our National Crime Victims Law Institute, and I said, Meg, how do you recommend I do this? And she was the one who said, the community is not homogenous, you gotta think creatively about this. And it just started to open up how we think about the inclusion of individuals. So for my level, it's the executive directors of the community-based agencies, but they're interested in learning about our work. I take them to lunch, I understand what they're interested in, and we talk a lot about trauma, and we talk a lot about their services and how to have voice around our executive level table. And I really am optimistic that will continue to trickle down to and through deeper ranks of those organizations to continue to include that voice.
Thanks, Abby. Ronald, same question.
Well, what we're doing at Just Leadership, part of what MacArthur funded us to do is we have a group of 700 leaders that's gone through our leadership development program, directly impacted people, in 38 states plus Washington, D.C. And part of our funding is to provide engagement opportunities between our network of leaders and the SJC sites around the country. And so we would advocate, for anybody interested in this type of work to reach out to our organization, to me as the director of outreach, and engage us, because the people we believe that those closer to the problem are closer to the solution, because you asked our panelists, would they have engaged the victim community, and there would have been, that's been a perfect thing for them to do, because the people that have been victims are the ones that can best inform on how you should, develop services for victims. And by the same token, those that have been directly impacted by crime or have created crime should be conferred to help resolve some of the issues that we have around that. So I would encourage anybody and all of you to engage Just Leadership and our network of leaders in your communities, because they're out there. We have a lot of people that's directly impacted, and they're doing great work, and they're high-performing people, high-accelerating people.
In one quick round, so we have a little bit of time for questions. What's the downside of not including victims in your conversations?
For me, it's like, what's the definition of insanity? Doing the same thing over, expecting a different result. That's the downside. If you continue to do what you're going to do, if you continue to do what you've done, you're going to continue to get what you've always gotten. So for me, that's the downside.
Abby?
In a traditional executive level collaboration, it is only the system partners, and that leaves the district attorney as the office that represents the voice of victims. That's been my experience, and our district attorney's office is amazing, but that's not the full picture. And so I think it's, again, you don't know what you don't know, and it behooves us to really ensure that we make that voice more broad and inclusive. Anna?
I wholeheartedly agree with what Ronald said. I couldn't say it better. And I think I would just add, from the perspective of a victim advocate, that the worst thing that could happen is we inadvertently create risk. And that's not what this effort is about. And so I believe that there's a pathway to have that conversation and be open. Systems don't move easily. In fact, they invite us to go back to what we know to do at every step of the way. And so I think it's about inadvertently creating risk and our desire to do better.
Okay. Thank you, you guys. Do we have any questions for any of the panelists, or do you have questions about what may be going on in your own communities and how you might want to include victims in your conversations? We're opening up the floor. Do we have the throw mic? If you, yes, why don't you just yell and then I'll try to repeat.
One of the things we have in Franklin County, Ohio, is a specialized docket for human trafficking. And we see this issue of people being defendants and victims very frequently. How would you see this and reaching out farther than the catchment of a specialized docket? And how can we begin to address this at all levels of our court system?
So Franklin County has a special docket for human trafficking victims, and they often see that people are both offenders and victims at the same time. And I believe your question is, how do we enhance that you've created a specialized docket, that you've now identified this as an issue? How do we help that, and how do we help these individuals beyond the specialized docket?
Just for clarification, one of the most difficult things about a specialized docket is that people have to volunteer. And if you
There you go. Whoa.
The whoopee cushion.
And if people are unwilling to, or unable, or don't have the insight, or are just too scared to recognize that they're victims, how do we start to provide services to them before they're ready for something as intensive as a high-risk, high-need specialized docket?
Wow.
Abby,
Well, thank you. I do a fair amount of trauma training for folks who might, for mostly law enforcement, and it's really interesting to begin the conversation around individuals and to take into someone's history and experience as the whole self. And I take my social worker background and try to translate that into meaningful law enforcement language, which is really, really hard to do. But sometimes that trauma-informed approach, which was developed by Sam so long ago, I wonder if, or you remain curious. You don't tell people, well, you're a crime victim, so you need to engage in the victim stuff. It's more, wow, that's a big story. Actually, my social worker is coming out of me right now. But really being curious about someone's experience and engaging in the conversation about, that must have been really hard. You were exposed to a lot of stuff. And sometimes if folks are exposed to a lot of stuff, other things happen. I'm curious if Anna might have some other insight to make my comments more eloquent and understandable.
No, I agree. I mean, I think that it is about the kinds of programs that we offer. And the approach of those programs. You know, in our county, we do this, it's called domestic violence orientation, which is everyone sentenced to probation has to come to this 3.5-hour class, which is not a good time. And so they come in, you know, annoyed they have to be there. It's a Saturday, they're resistant, they feel victimized in that they've been arrested and convicted, all those things. But for us, and the way that we speak to the people in that room is to say, like, I'm not here to debate with you whether you should or should not have been arrested. I'm here because I deeply care about what violence looks like in our community, what it has looked like in your life, and what you might offer that can help us unpack that. Period, the end. And that's where we stay with them. And so I do think it is about, when we think about programs as alternatives, I think being really intentional and conscious of what we're asking of those programs and being really clear as the collaborative or whatever, I don't know if every county calls it what we call it, but that what are we looking for and why? And how does that meet our goals and objectives? And making sure that we hold those providers accountable to that so that the work is being done in a way that invites people to consider their reality in maybe a different frame than they wouldn't have had we forced them into a program.
I think just briefly, I would say that, piggybacking on what Abby was saying, some type of peer coaching service where the social worker engages them in conversation instead of just saying, you're a victim and you should do A, B, C, and D. You invite them into a conversation, just talk to them, have a conversation about their lives, what they've gone through, the best times in their lives, the worst times in their lives. Just make it more human instead of clinical. And people will open up and they'll be more ready to talk about, being victim and victimizations.
Other questions?
This is a question for Ronald. You mentioned that you have foundation support to engage your network members, your trained leaders with Safety and Justice Challenge sites. Can you say more about that? Have you gotten much take-up? You said that if sites are interested, they should contact you. Have you had successful examples? And also, can you say more about what your network of leaders could do in a site?
This year, we've just got funded to do that this year. So we're launching that. We actually launching that engagement piece this year. We've identified 8 Safety and Justice Challenge sites that we're going to go to and have a community engagement between the SJC site coordinators and the alumni that we have in those communities. So at this time, we don't have any, outcome evidence to share with you, but we've had some good feedback of people that want to be engaged in it.
If sites are interested in that, should they just tackle you
Absolutely.
Today? Okay.
Yes.
All right. He's tall,
Yes, they
he's
should.
easy to pick out.
Hey.
I'm not quite as tall and as handsome, but we also offer those services. So if you are wanting to figure out how you engage in your victim community, you can tackle both Ron and I. Other questions?